5 men, 100 enemy soldiers, a single burst of automatic fire lasting 4 seconds. The patrol leader's hand goes up. Stop! Complete silence. For 18 hours, they do not move. They do not fire their weapons again. They do not call for extraction. They simply vanish into the jungle while the Viet Cong search for ghosts. This was not heroism. This was survival. Because in the mathematics of Australian SAS ambush doctrine, every trigger pull carried a weight that American soldiers never fully understood. If you fire, you reveal your position. If you reveal your position with only 5 men against a reinforced enemy battalion, you die. The Australians called it fire discipline. The Americans called it insanity. The Viet Cong called it something else entirely. They called it the reason they stopped patrolling at night. 23 kilometers northeast of Nui Date, in the dense jungle of Puak Tui Province, Sergeant Michael Brennan's 5-man patrol lay in absolute stillness. It was September 1968. They had been in position for 11 hours. The ambush site they had selected 3 days earlier sat astride a trail that intelligence suggested served as a supply route for D-445 Battalion. Brennan's patrol had moved into position the previous evening, each man placing himself with surgical precision in the undergrowth flanking the narrow path. They had cleared their fields of fire earlier that morning, removing individual leaves that might interfere with weapon sight lines, doing so with movements so slow that an observer 10 meters away would have seen nothing but jungle. Now they waited. The waiting was the hardest part, not because of boredom or discomfort, though both were present. The waiting was hard because every sound, every movement in the jungle around them could mean discovery. And discovery, for a 5-man patrol deep in enemy territory, meant almost certain death. At 1420 hours, Brennan heard them. The sound was subtle, barely distinguishable from the ambient noise of the jungle. Voices, Vietnamese voices, distant but approaching. He made no signal. His patrol members would hear the same sounds. They would know what was coming. The contact drill was ingrained through endless training. Wait, assess, react only when absolutely necessary. 3 minutes later, the first Viet Cong soldier appeared on the trail, then another, then 5 more. Brennan counted silently. 8, 9, 10. The enemy column kept coming. 15, 20, 25. His mind was already calculating. His patrol had 18 Claymore mines positioned to cover the killing zone. They had 5 automatic weapons. They had grenades. Against 25 enemy soldiers, those resources would be devastating. But 25 was not the problem. The problem was what came after 25, 30, 35, 40. The enemy column was larger than intelligence had predicted. Much larger. Brennan faced a decision that every SAS patrol commander in Vietnam confronted at some point. Do you spring the ambush against a force that massively outnumbers you, knowing that the firefight will draw every enemy soldier within kilometers to your position? Or do you let them pass, preserving your patrol's secrecy but abandoning the mission objective? American doctrine provided a clear answer. Call in artillery or air support. Engage with maximum firepower. Rely on superior mobility and extraction capabilities to disengage before the enemy can respond effectively. Australian doctrine was different. Australian doctrine said that if you cannot achieve overwhelming local superiority, even for the brief seconds of the ambush, you do not engage. You watch. You report. You survive to fight another day. Brennan let them pass. All 43 enemy soldiers walked through his killing zone without knowing that 5 Australian soldiers lay within grenade-throwing distance. The Viet Cong were armed, alert, and moving with tactical discipline, but they saw nothing, heard nothing, detected nothing. The Australians remained in position for another 6 hours after the enemy column disappeared. Standard doctrine called for remaining in ambush positions for extended periods after contact or near contact to observe enemy reaction and gather additional intelligence. At 20-30 hours, as darkness settled over the jungle, Brennan finally signaled withdrawal. His patrol moved 400 meters through terrain so dense that visibility rarely exceeded 5 meters, traveling in complete silence. At 2,200 hours, they established a temporary harbor position and radioed their observations back to Nui Dat. Intelligence officers processed the report with interest. A 43-man enemy force moving through that particular area suggested preparations for a larger operation. Within 12 hours, conventional Australian infantry forces would be redirected to intercept. Brennan's patrol had accomplished their mission without firing a shot. They had gathered critical intelligence that would shape task force operations for the next week. They had exposed themselves to minimal risk while providing maximum value. This was Australian SAS doctrine at its finest. But it was also doctrine that American observers found deeply frustrating. The frustration stemmed from fundamental philosophical differences about what constituted tactical success. American military culture in the 1960s measured success through direct action. Enemy eliminated, territory seized, firefights won. These were tangible, reportable achievements that fit neatly into the metrics that mattered to headquarters staff planning the war from Saigon. The Australian approach was harder to quantify. How do you measure the value of intelligence gathered? How do you report on ambushes that never happened because the patrol commander judged the odds unfavorable? How do you explain to generals and politicians that 5 men accomplished more by not fighting than they could have by engaging? The mathematics of SAS ambush doctrine were brutal and unforgiving. A 5-man patrol carried, on average, 180 rounds per rifle, 400 rounds per machine gun, 18 claymore mines, and 10 fragmentation grenades. In a perfectly executed ambush against an enemy force of platoon size, approximately 20 to 30 soldiers, this firepower was devastating. The claymores would initiate the ambush, sending 10,000 steel balls through the killing zone at 4,000 feet per second. In the smoke and confusion that followed, automatic weapons would pour fire into any survivors attempting to maneuver or withdraw. The entire engagement would last less than 30 seconds from initiation to cessation of fire. Enemy casualties would typically be catastrophic. Australian casualties in most cases would be 0, but these calculations depended on absolute surprise and perfect execution. They depended on the enemy being completely unaware of the ambush until the first claymore detonated. They depended on every Australian weapon functioning perfectly in the brief window when fire superiority mattered. Most critically, they depended on the enemy force being small enough that the Australians could suppress and neutralize it before reinforcements arrived. Any deviation from these perfect conditions changed the mathematics entirely. If the enemy detected the ambush before initiation, the tactical advantage evaporated. If the enemy force was larger than expected, the Australian firepower might prove insufficient. If Australian weapons malfunctioned, the patrol's ability to break contact and withdraw would be compromised. And if enemy reinforcements arrived quickly, a 5-man patrol had almost no capability to hold ground or fight a sustained engagement. This is why Australian SAS patrol commanders developed a reputation for what American observers sometimes called excessive caution. They would abort ambushes if enemy forces were too large. They would withdraw without engaging if conditions were not optimal. They would spend days watching a trail without initiating contact if the tactical picture was unclear. To American commanders accustomed to aggressive action and confidence in superior firepower, this approach seemed passive, even cowardly. But the statistics told a different story. Between 1966 and 1971, Australian SAS patrols conducted approximately 1,200 operations in Vietnam. They initiated contact with enemy forces on 298 occasions. They killed 492 confirmed enemy soldiers with an additional 106 probable kills. Their own losses during this period totaled 1 killed in action, 1 died of wounds, 3 accidentally killed, 1 missing, presumed dead, and 28 wounded. The kill ratio was approximately 17-1 for confirmed kills, 20-1 including probables. By comparison, conventional American infantry units in Vietnam averaged kill ratios between 1-1 and 3-1 during the same period. The difference was not superior marksmanship or better equipment. Australian soldiers carried older weapons than their American counterparts. Their L1A1 self-loading rifles were reliable but not cutting-edge. Their radios were a generation behind American communications gear. The difference was doctrine. Specifically, it was doctrine built around the acknowledgement that a 5-man patrol deep in enemy territory exists in a constant state of extreme vulnerability. The jungle provided concealment, but concealment was not protection. A concealed position could be compromised by a single mistake, a moment of carelessness, bad luck. Once compromised, a patrol's survival depended entirely on its ability to break contact and withdraw before the enemy could mass forces for a counterattack. This meant that every tactical decision had to be evaluated through the lens of risk versus reward. Would the potential intelligence or enemy casualties gained from an ambush justify the risk of compromise and the possibility of Australian casualties or patrol loss? American doctrine provided different answers to these questions. American patrols operated with the knowledge that they could call on massive fire support. Artillery was always available within minutes. Helicopter gunships could respond to contact almost immediately. Medical evacuation for wounded soldiers could be arranged rapidly. This changed the risk calculus fundamentally. An American patrol that made contact with a superior enemy force could hold position and fight, knowing that help was coming. The tactical situation might be difficult, but it was rarely hopeless. Australian SAS patrols operated under no such assurances. Artillery support was available, but coordinating fire missions while under contact and attempting to break contact simultaneously was extremely difficult. Helicopter extraction during an active firefight was possible but not guaranteed. The jungle canopy made landing zones scarce, and enemy forces that had ambushed an ambush were typically alert and aggressive. In practical terms, an Australian SAS patrol that made contact under unfavorable conditions had to assume it would fight alone for an extended period. This assumption shaped every aspect of their operational doctrine. Patrol commanders learned to think in terms of escape routes before thinking about killing zones. When selecting an ambush position, the first consideration was not optimal fields of fire, but multiple withdrawal paths that the patrol could use under fire. Each man in the patrol needed to know without being told which direction to move if contact was initiated unexpectedly. The immediate action drill for contact was not to establish fire superiority and hold ground. It was to deliver maximum violence for 10 to 15 seconds, then withdraw along pre-planned routes while enemy survivors were still disoriented. Speed of disengagement was more important than enemy body count. This doctrine produced ambushes that looked very different from American ambushes. American ambush doctrine emphasized the L-shaped formation, with one element initiating contact and a second element providing flanking fire to prevent enemy withdrawal or maneuver. The goal was to trap enemy forces in the killing zone and destroy them systematically. Australian SAS ambushes used linear formations positioned along a single axis. The goal was not to trap the enemy, but to deliver overwhelming fire into the killing zone for a brief period, then withdraw before the enemy could organize an effective response. This difference reflected different priorities. American doctrine prioritized enemy casualties. Australian doctrine prioritized patrol survival. The tactical implications were profound. Consider a typical ambush scenario. An American patrol detecting an enemy force of 30 soldiers on a trail would likely spring the ambush, call in artillery or air support, and attempt to prevent the enemy from withdrawing until that support arrived. If the enemy attempted to maneuver against the American position, the patrol would hold ground and fight, trusting that reinforcements or fire support would tip the balance. An Australian SAS patrol detecting the same enemy force would evaluate whether 30 soldiers represented a manageable target or an unacceptable risk. If the patrol commander judged that the ambush could be executed perfectly, delivering devastating casualties in the first seconds, the ambush would proceed. But if there was any uncertainty about the enemy's strength, disposition, or proximity to reinforcements, the ambush would likely be aborted. The patrol would observe, report, and withdraw without engaging. This conservatism had costs. Intelligence officers sometimes complained that SAS patrols were too reluctant to engage. Conventional unit commanders expressed frustration that enemies were being spotted and tracked, but not eliminated. The body count, that metric that dominated American assessments of tactical success, was lower than it could have been if every contact opportunity resulted in engagement. But the body count metric missed a crucial dimension of tactical effectiveness. Dead enemy soldiers are valuable, but live Australian soldiers conducting continuous reconnaissance deep in enemy territory are more valuable. A patrol that engages every time it detects enemy forces will eventually be compromised, engaged, and possibly destroyed. A patrol that engages selectively only when conditions favor overwhelming Australian advantage can operate indefinitely. The mathematics supported the conservative approach. An SAS squadron deployed to Vietnam for 12 months would typically conduct 240 to 250 patrols during that period. Each patrol consisted of 5 men operating for 7 to 14 days in enemy territory. This meant that at any given time, roughly 20 to 25 Australian soldiers were conducting reconnaissance or ambush operations across an area of several hundred square kilometers. The intelligence they gathered about enemy movements, base locations, supply routes, and operational patterns was extraordinarily valuable. It shaped larger task force operations, allowed conventional units to be positioned effectively, and enabled artillery and air assets to target enemy concentrations with precision. But all of this intelligence depended on the patrols remaining undetected and operationally effective. A single patrol compromised and destroyed did not just mean 5 casualties. It meant one less patrol conducting reconnaissance. It meant a gap in intelligence coverage that could not be filled immediately. It meant that the enemy would be more alert and cautious, making subsequent operations more difficult. The trade-off, then, was not between engaging the enemy or being passive. The trade-off was between short-term tactical gains through direct action and long-term strategic advantages through sustained reconnaissance. Australian doctrine chose the latter. But choosing the latter required accepting psychological burdens that American soldiers did not face. For American soldiers, contact with the enemy, while dangerous, also provided a sense of agency and control. You could shoot back. You could call for fire support. You could do something. For Australian SAS soldiers, contact with the enemy often meant doing nothing. It meant watching enemy soldiers move through your ambush site without engaging. It meant hearing them talk, seeing them rest, observing them eat, and knowing that you could kill them, but choosing not to because the tactical conditions were unfavorable. This psychological experience was profoundly different from conventional combat. It required a level of discipline and emotional control that standard military training did not address. Sergeant Tom Wills, a patrol commander with 2 Squadron SAS, described the experience in a classified debriefing conducted in 1969. His patrol had established an ambush position along a trail that intelligence identified as a major resupply route. Over 3 days, they observed 23 separate enemy movements through their position. The smallest group consisted of 2 soldiers. The largest consisted of 37 soldiers with porters carrying supplies. Wills initiated ambush against exactly one of these groups, a 7-man enemy patrol moving in tactical formation with no porters and no heavy weapons. The ambush lasted 12 seconds. All 7 enemy soldiers were killed or wounded. Wills' patrol withdrew immediately and was extracted by helicopter 18 hours later without further contact. American intelligence officers reviewing Wills's report asked why he had not engaged the larger enemy forces. Wills's answer was direct. Against 7 soldiers, his patrol had overwhelming firepower and clear escape routes. Against 37 soldiers, even if the initial ambush was perfectly executed, survivors would likely include enough combat-effective soldiers to pursue and engage his patrol during withdrawal. The risk was unacceptable. The American officers pushed back. Surely, a surprise ambush with 18 Claymore mines would devastate even a large enemy force. Surely, the tactical situation would favor the Australians even against greater numbers. Wills explained the mathematics. 18 Claymores would indeed inflict massive casualties, but Claymore mines detonate in a fan pattern. Not every steel ball hits a target. Not every target struck is immediately incapacitated. In ambushes against large enemy forces, even perfectly executed ambushes, some soldiers typically survive the initial detonation. Those survivors, while disoriented and under fire, would attempt to locate and engage the ambush force. In a perfectly executed ambush, Australian fire would suppress these survivors long enough for the patrol to withdraw, but perfect execution was not guaranteed. Weapons could malfunction. Ammunition could run out faster than expected. Enemy reinforcements could arrive sooner than anticipated. Any of these factors would place the patrol in extreme danger. Against 7 soldiers, these risks were acceptable. Against 37, they were not. The American officers remained unconvinced. They noted that American Special Operations units, particularly MACV-SOG reconnaissance teams regularly engaged enemy forces of similar size. They achieved favorable outcomes through aggressive action and reliance on fire support. Wills did not argue. He simply noted that American SOG teams operated with immediate access to air support, including fast movers and helicopter gunships. They also operated with the expectation that if a team was compromised, extraction would be prioritized regardless of risk. Australian SAS patrols had neither of these advantages. Air support was available but not immediate. Extraction was possible but not guaranteed, particularly if the landing zone was under enemy fire. The patrol had to assume it would fight alone for at least 30 minutes, possibly longer. That assumption changed everything. This exchange, documented in declassified MACV intelligence files, captured the fundamental difference between American and Australian approaches to small unit operations in Vietnam. Both approaches had merit. Both achieved results. But they were built on different assumptions about acceptable risk and tactical priorities. The American approach maximized enemy casualties and tactical aggression. The Australian approach maximized patrol survival and intelligence gathering. The casualties statistics suggested that the Australian approach, while less aggressive, was more sustainable over extended operations. But statistics alone do not capture the psychological and moral complexity of ambush doctrine based on extreme fire discipline. Consider the experience from the enemy's perspective. A Viet Cong soldier moving through the jungle might pass within meters of an Australian SAS patrol without knowing it. The Australians would be completely invisible, concealed by camouflage, stillness, and jungle vegetation. They would watch the enemy soldier pass. They would let him live because engaging him would compromise their position. From the Australian perspective, this was sound tactical judgment. From the enemy soldier's perspective, had he known, it would have been terrifying. You survived not because the Australians missed you or showed mercy. You survived because killing you was not tactically advantageous. The moment killing you became advantageous, you would die without warning or chance to defend yourself. This created a psychological dimension to Australian SAS operations that enemy forces found profoundly disturbing. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army were experienced, capable fighters. They had faced American military power for years. They understood American tactics and had developed effective counter-tactics, but they could not develop effective counter-tactics against an enemy they could not detect. The Viet Cong gave Australian SAS patrols a name, Ma Rung, jungle ghosts. The name reflected genuine fear. You could prepare for American operations. You could hear their helicopters coming. You could see their patrols moving through the jungle. You could predict their patterns and plan ambushes accordingly. Australian SAS patrols provided no such indicators. They inserted silently, moved invisibly, struck without warning, and vanished before you could respond. And most unnerving of all, they might be watching you right now without you knowing. Captured enemy documents from 1968 and 1969 included specific tactical guidance for units operating in areas where Australian SAS were known to patrol. The guidance was stark. Avoid unnecessary movement, especially at night. Assume you are being watched. Do not establish predictable patterns. If contact with Australian forces appears imminent, withdraw rather than engage. These instructions reflected a level of caution that the Viet Cong did not apply to American forces. Against Americans, the guidance emphasized aggressive ambush and rapid maneuver. Against Australians, the guidance emphasized avoidance. The psychological advantage this created was significant. Enemy forces operating in areas patrolled by Australian SAS became cautious, defensive, and less effective. They moved less frequently. They established fewer temporary bases. They conducted fewer offensive operations. The mere possibility of Australian SAS presence was sufficient to degrade enemy effectiveness. But achieving this psychological dominance required Australian patrol commanders to make decisions that were psychologically difficult. Letting enemy soldiers pass through ambush sites without engaging violated every aggressive instinct that combat training cultivated. Watching enemy forces from concealment for days without taking action created frustration and sometimes doubt. Was this really more effective than direct action? Could we have killed those soldiers if we had engaged? The patrol commanders who succeeded in Vietnam learned to suppress these instincts and trust the doctrine. They learned that patience was more valuable than aggression, that survival was more important than glory, that the mission was intelligence gathering, not body count accumulation. They learned these lessons because their training emphasized them relentlessly and because operational experience validated them consistently. But the lessons came with psychological costs. Soldiers who learned to suppress aggressive instincts in combat found those instincts difficult to restore in peacetime. Men who became comfortable watching enemies without engaging found civilian life, where passive observation was not a survival skill, uncomfortable and alienating. The transformation required to become an effective SAS patrol operator was profound. The reverse transformation, returning to civilian normalcy, was often incomplete. This psychological dimension of Australian SAS operations remained largely hidden from public view. The operations themselves were classified. The tactics were sensitive. The psychological screening and training methods were proprietary. What emerged in public accounts was a sanitized version emphasizing heroism and tactical excellence, while omitting the psychological complexity and moral ambiguity of jungle warfare conducted at knife-fighting range against an enemy you often chose not to fight. The doctrine's most difficult moments came not during planned ambushes but during chance encounters. A patrol moving through the jungle might stumble onto an enemy position. The enemy might stumble onto the patrol's position. In these moments, doctrine provided no clear guidance because the situation was inherently unpredictable. Standard training emphasized immediate action drills. If compromised, deliver maximum firepower immediately to shock and disorient the enemy, then withdraw along pre-planned escape routes. But immediate action drills assumed that compromise was obvious and mutual. What happened when the situation was ambiguous? Consider a patrol moving through dense jungle. The point man, 20 meters ahead of the patrol commander, freezes and raises his hand. Stop! Danger! The patrol freezes instantly. Every man sinks silently into whatever cover is available. Minutes pass. The point man makes another signal. Enemy! Close! The patrol commander cannot see what the point man sees. The jungle is too dense. He must trust the point man's judgment. More minutes pass. The point man does not open fire. This suggests the enemy has not detected the patrol. But why has the point man not moved? Because moving might reveal the patrol's position. The patrol commander faces a decision. Order the patrol to remain frozen and wait for the enemy to move away. Signal the point man to withdraw slowly back to the patrol. Initiate ambush against an enemy force whose size and disposition are unknown. Each option carried distinct risks that patrol commanders learned to calculate in seconds. Remaining frozen was safest if the enemy had not detected the patrol and would move away naturally. But if the enemy was establishing a position or conducting a search, remaining frozen could result in eventual detection under circumstances where the patrol had lost initiative. Withdrawing the point man was theoretically sound, but required movement. Any movement created signatures that could reveal the patrol's position, and if the enemy force was large and alert, attempting to withdraw one man could trigger contact under the worst possible conditions. Initiating ambush provided maximum violence and shock, potentially allowing the patrol to escape while the enemy was disoriented. But it committed the patrol to action without full knowledge of what they faced. An ambush initiated blindly could turn into a disaster if the enemy force was larger, better positioned, or more prepared than anticipated. Lieutenant James Parker, a patrol commander with 3 Squadron SAS, faced exactly this decision in October 1967. His patrol was conducting reconnaissance north of the Mai Tao Mountains when his point man signaled enemy contact. Parker could hear voices, Vietnamese voices, multiple speakers, close enough that individual words were occasionally distinguishable. He could not see them. The jungle between his position and the enemy was too dense. He had no idea how many enemy soldiers were present. Parker made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward, though not for the reasons he expected. He ordered his patrol to remain frozen in place. For the next 4 hours and 20 minutes, his 5-man patrol lay absolutely motionless while enemy soldiers conducted activities less than 15 meters away. The enemy never detected them. The sound suggested they were resting, eating, and conducting equipment maintenance. Parker counted at least 8 distinct voices, possibly more. At one point, an enemy soldier urinated within 5 meters of Parker's position. The man stood 3 meters away, clearly visible through gaps in the vegetation, his back turned, completely unaware that 5 heavily armed Australian soldiers were watching him. Parker did not fire. He did not signal his men to fire. The tactical situation was unfavorable. The enemy's numbers were uncertain. Their disposition was unknown. Engaging might provide a brief tactical advantage, but it would certainly compromise the patrol's position and trigger a response from whatever additional enemy forces were in the area. The mathematics did not favor engagement. After the war, during a recorded interview for the Australian War Memorial's Oral History Project, Parker was asked about this decision. The interviewer noted that Parker's patrol could have killed several enemy soldiers with minimal risk during those 4 hours. Why didn't they? Parker's response was matter of fact. Killing 3 or 4 enemy soldiers would have felt satisfying. It would have made a good after-action report, but it would have accomplished nothing strategically. His patrol's mission was reconnaissance, not body count accumulation. Engaging would have compromised the patrol, terminated the mission, and provided the enemy with knowledge that Australian patrols were operating in that area. The intelligence his patrol gathered by observing enemy activity without engaging was more valuable than the enemy casualties they could have inflicted. The interviewer pressed further. Wasn't it difficult to watch enemy soldiers that close and not fire? Parker paused before answering. The pause lasted nearly 10 seconds on the recording. Then he said something that captured the essential psychology of Australian SAS operations. The difficult part was not wanting to fire. The difficult part was knowing that firing would feel good, would feel like doing something, but that feeling good was not the same as making the right tactical decision. Any competent soldier could pull a trigger. SAS soldiers were trained to not pull triggers when pulling them would be counterproductive. That discipline, that ability to separate emotional impulses from tactical judgment, was what differentiated special operations from conventional infantry. But it was also what made returning to civilian life difficult. Civilians did not understand why someone would choose inaction when action was possible. They could not comprehend the calculation that made restraint more valuable than violence. Parker himself struggled to explain it to his family, his friends, his children. How do you tell someone that your proudest moment in combat was choosing not to fight? This psychological dimension extended beyond individual patrol commanders to entire patrol teams. Every man in an SAS patrol understood fire discipline intellectually. They had been trained extensively. They had practiced scenarios. They knew the doctrine. But understanding doctrine and executing it while lying in jungle undergrowth with enemy soldiers close enough to touch were different things. The patrol commander's decision not to fire had to be accepted and implemented by every patrol member without discussion, without question, without visible reaction. One man breaking discipline, one accidental noise, one movement, could compromise the entire patrol. This created a level of trust and mutual dependence that was difficult to overstate. Your life depended on your patrol members maintaining discipline in circumstances that every instinct urged them to abandon. Their lives depended on you making correct decisions when those decisions contradicted emotional impulses and cultural expectations about military valor. Corporal Peter Hammond served as a signaler with 1 Squadron SAS during their second tour. In a 2003 interview, he described an incident that he believed captured the essence of SAS ambush doctrine. His patrol had been observing a trail junction for 3 days without seeing significant enemy activity. On the 4th day, at approximately 1400 hours, a large enemy force appeared. Hammond counted 61 soldiers moving in loose tactical formation. They were well-armed, disciplined, and clearly experienced. The patrol commander, a sergeant whose name Hammond declined to provide, watched them for approximately 7 minutes as they passed through the patrol's observation area. Then the enemy force stopped. They did not establish a defensive perimeter. They simply stopped in place, soldiers standing or sitting casually, smoking cigarettes and talking. Hammond's patrol was positioned 30 meters away. They had 18 Claymore mines positioned to cover multiple approach routes. They had clear fields of fire. The enemy was bunched together, violating basic tactical dispersion. It was, Hammond said, the most target-rich environment he ever encountered in Vietnam. A perfect ambush scenario except for one detail. 61 enemy soldiers was not a force that 5 Australians could engage with confidence of favorable outcome. The patrol commander made no signal. The patrol remained frozen. For 27 minutes, while enemy soldiers rested less than 30 meters away, the Australians did not move. Hammond described the psychological experience as simultaneously terrifying and frustrating. Terrifying because detection seemed inevitable. With that many enemy soldiers that close, surely someone would notice something. A reflection off a weapon, an unnatural shape in the vegetation, a scent that did not belong. Any of these things could trigger discovery, and discovery would result in a firefight against odds that no amount of training could overcome. But the terror was mixed with frustration. Here was the enemy, vulnerable, unaware, presenting a target that artillery observers dream about. The patrol could call in fire missions that would devastate this force. They could initiate their own ambush, inflict heavy casualties, and withdraw under covering fire. They could do something. Instead, they did nothing. They watched. They counted. They noted the enemy's weapons, equipment, and direction of movement. They remained absolutely still while enemy soldiers laughed and joked and smoked cigarettes within grenade-throwing distance. The enemy eventually moved on. Hammond's patrol remained in position for another 4 hours before withdrawing. The intelligence they reported led to a battalion-sized operation that interdicted the enemy force 3 days later, resulting in significant enemy casualties and the capture of a supply cache. Hammond acknowledged this outcome justified the patrol commander's decision, but he also acknowledged that at the time, lying in the jungle watching enemies they could have killed, the decision felt wrong. It felt like cowardice, even though Hammond knew intellectually that it was sound tactics. The emotional and intellectual response were misaligned, and that misalignment created psychological tension that Hammond described as one of the most difficult aspects of SAS operations. You were trained to think tactically, but you were also human with human instincts that tactical thinking had to suppress. Learning to suppress those instincts was one thing. Living with the memory of having suppressed them was another. This tension between tactical judgment and emotional impulse appeared repeatedly in after-action reports and veteran interviews. Patrol commanders reported feeling doubt about decisions even when those decisions proved correct. Patrol members reported struggling with restraint even when they understood its necessity. The psychological burden was not guilt about actions taken, but uncertainty about actions not taken. What if the patrol had engaged? Would they have achieved similar intelligence outcomes with the added benefit of enemy casualties? What if the tactical assessment was wrong? What if they could have successfully ambushed that 61-man force and withdrawn safely? These questions had no definitive answers. Tactical decisions in combat are made with incomplete information under stress. Monday morning, quarterbacking with full knowledge of outcomes is intellectually dishonest. But knowing this did not prevent the questions from haunting the men who made those decisions. Doctrine provided general principles, but not specific answers. The patrol commander's training, experience, and judgment determined what happened next. In 1967, a patrol from 1 Squadron SAS found itself in exactly this situation. The patrol commander, Sergeant David Reeves, ordered his patrol to remain frozen. They did not move for 7 hours. During that time, they heard enemy soldiers talking, moving equipment, and conducting routine activities less than 30 meters from their position. The enemy never detected them. At dusk, the enemy soldiers departed. Reeves' patrol waited an additional 2 hours, then withdrew to an alternate position and called for extraction the following morning. Reeves' after-action report concluded that the enemy soldiers had been establishing a temporary base camp. He estimated 15 to 20 soldiers based on voices heard. He judged that engaging would have been tactically unsound given the enemy's numbers, proximity, and the patrol's lack of escape routes in the immediate area. His report was reviewed and approved by Squadron Command. But not all patrol commanders made similar decisions. In 1968, a patrol from 2 Squadron SAS encountered an enemy force under similar circumstances. The patrol commander, Sergeant Robert Mills, assessed that the enemy had detected the patrol's presence even if they had not yet located the patrol's exact position. He ordered immediate ambush. 3 Claymore mines detonated simultaneously. The patrol's automatic weapons fired for approximately 10 seconds. 4 enemy soldiers were confirmed killed. The patrol withdrew under sporadic return fire and was extracted by helicopter 4 hours later. Mills sustained minor shrapnel wounds during withdrawal. 2 other patrol members were uninjured. Mills's after-action report concluded that engaging was necessary because remaining in position after being detected would have allowed the enemy to organize and execute an ambush against the patrol. His report was also reviewed and approved by Squadron Command. These 2 incidents, occurring within months of each other, produced opposite tactical decisions from experienced patrol commanders facing similar situations. Both decisions were judged appropriate by higher command. This flexibility reflected Australian SAS doctrine's fundamental principle. The patrol commander on the ground, with full situational awareness, was best positioned to make tactical decisions. Trust the man in the field. This principle contrasted sharply with American military culture, which emphasized detailed planning, adherence to standard procedures, and seeking permission from higher command before deviating from mission parameters. Australian patrol commanders were expected to deviate from mission parameters whenever tactical conditions warranted. They were expected to make decisions independently, without seeking approval. They were expected to trust their judgment even when that judgment contradicted planning assumptions or intelligence estimates. This operational autonomy created enormous psychological pressure. A patrol commander whose decision resulted in Australian casualties bore responsibility that could not be shared or deflected. A commander who chose not to engage, allowing enemy soldiers to escape, had to live with the knowledge that those soldiers might kill Allied troops elsewhere. A commander who chose to engage, initiating an ambush that went badly, had to live with the consequences for his patrol members. These decisions were not academic exercises conducted in comfortable headquarters. They were life and death judgments made in seconds while sitting in jungle undergrowth with enemy soldiers nearby. The margin between sound tactical judgment and fatal mistake was measured in individual choices about when to fire and when to remain silent. The American officers observing Australian SAS operations understood the tactical principles but struggled to replicate the psychological development required to execute those principles effectively. They understood fire discipline. They understood the importance of surprise. They understood the need for careful ambush site selection. But understanding principles was not the same as internalizing them to the point where they governed instinctive reactions under stress. American training emphasized aggressive action. When compromised, American soldiers were trained to assault through the ambush, return fire immediately, maneuver aggressively. These responses were appropriate for soldiers operating as part of larger units with fire support available. They were less appropriate for 5-man patrols operating alone in enemy territory. Australian training emphasized stillness and patience. When situations were ambiguous, the default response was not action, but observation. Wait. Assess. Act only when you have clarity about the tactical situation and favorable odds. This difference in default responses shaped outcomes in ways that were subtle but significant. An American patrol detecting enemy movement might immediately maneuver to establish a better position or prepare to engage. That movement, however slight, created noise and disturbance that increased the chance of detection. An Australian patrol detecting the same enemy movement would freeze in place, controlling even breathing to minimize any signature. That stillness, maintained for hours if necessary, maximized the chance of remaining undetected. Over time, these different default responses accumulated into dramatically different operational outcomes. By 1969, American military analysts had documented the difference clearly. Australian SAS patrols were compromised by enemy forces approximately one-tenth as often as American reconnaissance patrols operating in similar areas. When compromised, Australian patrols suffered casualties approximately one-fifth as often as American patrols. The difference was not equipment, individual soldier capability, or quality of intelligence. The difference was doctrine and the training required to execute that doctrine effectively. The Pentagon recognized this. Multiple studies and reports recommended adopting Australian-style training and doctrine for American reconnaissance units. Some changes were implemented. American LRRP, Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol, training began incorporating more emphasis on stealth and fire discipline. Some special operations units adopted modified versions of Australian ambush doctrine, but wholesale adoption of Australian methods never occurred. The institutional barriers were too significant. American military culture valued aggressive action too deeply to embrace doctrine built on patience and restraint. Commanders accustomed to measuring success through enemy casualties could not accept doctrine that deliberately avoided engagement opportunities. Training pipelines designed to produce large numbers of qualified soldiers could not accommodate the extended, intensive preparation that Australian SAS selection and training required. The Australian approach was not scalable to American force structure, and attempting to scale it would have required cultural changes that the American military was unwilling or unable to make. So the two approaches continued in parallel. American forces pursued aggressive search and destroy operations, accepting higher casualties in exchange for higher enemy body counts. Australian forces pursued patient reconnaissance and selective ambush operations, accepting lower enemy casualties in exchange for dramatically lower friendly casualties. Both approaches achieved results appropriate to their strategic objectives, but when assessed purely on the metric of patrol survival and operational sustainability, the Australian approach was demonstrably superior. This superiority was purchased through psychological burdens that remained hidden from public view until decades after the war. The men who learned to watch enemies without engaging, who made life and death decisions in seconds with no opportunity for consultation or validation, who accepted responsibility for their patrol's survival while operating deep in enemy territory with minimal support, carried those experiences forward into lives that often struggled to accommodate them. Some adapted successfully. They processed their experiences, found meaning in their service, and built satisfying civilian careers and families. Others struggled. They found civilian employment frustrating and meaningless. They found civilian social interactions uncomfortable and artificial. They found themselves constantly alert, scanning for threats that did not exist, unable to relax in environments that posed no actual danger. Post-traumatic stress among Australian Vietnam veterans manifested differently than among American veterans. Americans struggled with the memory of firefights, casualties, and the moral complexity of a controversial war. Australians struggled with those same things, but also with the memory of restraint, of watching enemies they could have killed, of making decisions where choosing inaction felt like abandoning duty, of surviving when others died, not through chance, but through doctrine that prioritized survival over heroism. These psychological dimensions rarely appeared in official accounts. They did not fit the narrative that either government wanted to promote. Australian authorities wanted to emphasize tactical excellence and mission success. American authorities wanted to explain why their own casualties were so much higher. Neither government wanted to discuss the psychological cost of becoming the kind of soldier who could execute Australian SAS doctrine effectively. But the soldiers themselves knew. In the decades after the war, informal networks of veterans provided support and understanding that official channels did not. Men who had served in SAS patrols understood each other's experiences in ways that conventional infantry veterans did not. They had made decisions under pressure that conventional soldiers never faced. They had developed psychological adaptations that were necessary for survival in the jungle, but maladaptive in civilian life. They had learned to suppress instincts, control emotions, and function in states of heightened alertness for extended periods. Those capabilities did not switch off when the war ended. The doctrine that made Australian SAS operations so effective in Vietnam, the fire discipline that allowed 5-man patrols to survive and operate effectively against numerically superior enemy forces, came with costs that endured long after the patrols ended. The mathematics were clear. Extreme fire discipline produced favorable casualties ratios. Patience produced better intelligence than aggression. Selective engagement produced sustainable operations. But the human cost of developing and maintaining that discipline, that patience, that selectivity, was measured in ways that statistics could not capture. The men who became jungle ghosts, who learned to become invisible and lethal simultaneously, who made split-second decisions about when to fire and when to remain silent, paid prices that extended far beyond their years in Vietnam. They achieved tactical excellence that military historians still study decades later. They demonstrated that alternative approaches to jungle warfare were possible and effective. They proved that small units properly trained and led could achieve results disproportionate to their size. But they also demonstrated that such excellence requires transforming soldiers in ways that may be irreversible, and that those transformations carry costs that societies must acknowledge even when they cannot fully understand. This is the untold dimension of Australian SAS operations in Vietnam. Not just what they achieved, but what achieving it required them to become. Not just the tactical brilliance of their ambush doctrine, but the psychological weight of executing that doctrine day after day in a jungle where every decision could mean life or death. Not just the statistics of 17-to-1 kill ratios, but the silent burden of the men who survived by learning when not to fire. If we fire, we die. This was not cowardice. This was the coldest kind of courage, the courage to watch enemies you could kill, the courage to let them pass because the tactical situation was unfavorable, the courage to trust doctrine and training when every instinct screamed for action, the courage to make decisions knowing you would carry them forever, regardless of outcome. The jungle ghosts of Vietnam achieved what seemed impossible. 5 men defeating forces 10 times their size, patrols surviving for weeks in enemy territory without detection, intelligence gathering that shaped battles and saved lives. But they achieved it by becoming something other than conventional soldiers. They became hunters who could also be hunted, predators who knew they were simultaneously prey, warriors who understood that the highest form of tactical excellence was knowing when not to fight. The Viet Cong called them Ma Rung. The Americans tried to copy them, but never quite succeeded. The Australian military studied their methods and preserved their doctrine, but the men themselves, the patrol commanders who made those decisions, the soldiers who lay frozen for hours watching enemies pass, They carried knowledge that no training could fully prepare someone for, and no debriefing could fully process. They knew what it meant to hold a life in your hands, represented by a trigger under your finger, and choose not to take it, not because of mercy or morality, but because of mathematics. Because fire discipline was survival, because staying silent meant living to fight another day. Because in the jungle with 5 men against 100, if we fire, we die, and dying served no purpose.